Malcolm X once warned that the greatest threat to freedom is not always chains or guns but control over the mind. He understood, long before the age of 24-hour news cycles and endless social feeds, that those who control information also control how people understand truth, justice, and leadership. His words were not meant for one generation. They were meant for ours. Today, we live in a world where headlines move faster than facts, where narratives are carefully framed, and where emotions are often manipulated to keep us divided, distracted, and dependent. Stories are told and retold until they feel true, even when crucial pieces are missing. Malcolm X saw this pattern clearly. He warned that power does not always silence people, it often speaks for them, deciding who is heard, who is ignored, and who is labeled a hero or a threat. This is not just history, it is a mirror. When we look closely, we begin to notice how public opinion is shaped, how leaders are manufactured, and how entire communities are guided towards certain beliefs without ever being given the full picture. Malcolm's challenged people to question what they were told, to ask who benefits from a story, and to recognize that real change begins with awareness. In this video, we will explore the warnings Malcolm X left behind, warnings that many dismissed at the time, but which feel disturbingly familiar today. His message was not about fear, it was about clarity, responsibility, and the power of independent thought. If we truly listen, his words force us to confront uncomfortable questions about the world we live in and the roles we play within it. If this kind of content matters to you, stories that challenge mainstream narratives and uncover the truths often left out, support the channel by liking the video and subscribing. Your engagement helps keep these conversations alive. Let's begin. Malcolm X did not speak in abstractions. When he warned about the rise of celebrity figures as political voices, he was not criticizing talent, success, or visibility. He was pointing to something deeper and far more subtle, a system that prefers recognizable faces over accountable leadership, and spectacle over structure. In his view, fame could be weaponized, not to liberate communities, but to pacify them. This warning connects directly to his broader concern about media control, because the same forces that shape narratives also decide who gets elevated as a voice for the people. Malcolm noticed that entertainers were increasingly presented as representatives of political struggle, not because they had organized communities or challenged power at its roots, but because they were safe, familiar, and easily marketable. Their influence flowed through admiration rather than responsibility. A celebrity could speak, be applauded, trend for a moment, and then disappear back into comfort, while the deeper conditions affecting ordinary people remained unchanged. This, Malcolm argued, created an illusion of progress. It felt like movement, but it rarely produced transformation. What troubled him most was not that celebrities spoke on social issues, but that communities were encouraged to mistake visibility for leadership. Real grassroots leaders operate quietly, often without protection or recognition. Building systems, educating people, and confronting power directly. Their work is slow, uncomfortable, and resistant to simplification. Celebrity activism, by contrast, fits neatly into soundbites and headlines. It can be celebrated without threatening the structures that benefit from inequality. In this way, attention is redirected upward, away from collective action, toward individuals who are easier to manage and easier to replace. This pattern mirrors the larger media dynamic Malcolm warned about. The public is taught not only what to think, but who to listen to. Authority becomes linked to popularity rather than accountability, and leadership is measured by reach instead of results. When people begin to look to entertainers for direction, they are subtly discouraged from looking inward, from organizing locally, or from demanding structural change that cannot be packaged into a single speech or moment. The story becomes about inspiration rather than power, emotion rather than strategy. Malcolm understood that this dynamic could drain movements of their urgency. People might feel represented without being empowered, heard without being protected, included without having control over their own futures. In such an environment, frustration builds, but it is often misdirected. Energy that could be used to build institutions, train organizers, or challenge unjust systems is instead spent debating personalities, defending symbols, or waiting for the next public statement from someone famous. Over time, this creates dependence. Communities begin to wait for validation from above instead of cultivating leadership from within. Structural change requires coordination, sacrifice, and sustained pressure, none of which can be carried by individual stars alone. Malcolm's warning was not cynical, it was strategic. He believed liberation could not be outsourced to icons. It had to be rooted in education, discipline, and collective responsibility. Seen through this lens, his words feel less like criticism and more like instruction. He was urging people to recognize the difference between representation and power, between being seen and being free. The elevation of celebrity voices, when left unexamined, risks turning struggle into performance and resistance into branding. Malcolm challenged his audience to look beyond the spotlight, to ask who benefits from the attention, and to remember that lasting change has never come from admiration alone, but from organized people who refuse to be distracted from the work that truly reshapes society. Malcolm X's understanding of power did not stop at media narratives or symbolic leadership. He followed the consequences of those systems into the streets, where authority became physical and fear was enforced through routine encounters with the law. Long before the term systemic entered everyday language, Malcolm described police brutality and racial profiling as built-in features of a larger structure, not the result of a few bad decisions or isolated moments. To him, these patterns were predictable outcomes of a society that defined certain communities as threats before any crime had taken place. This perspective fits seamlessly with his warnings about media control. When a population is repeatedly portrayed as dangerous, disorderly, or inferior, it becomes easier to justify constant surveillance and aggressive policing. Malcolm recognized that public opinion was carefully shaped so that force could be framed as protection, and injustice could be defended as necessity. The narrative came first, the violence followed. Once people accepted the story, they were less likely to question the methods used to enforce it. Malcolm often pointed out that law enforcement did not operate in a vacuum. Police behavior reflected the values and fears of the society that empowered them. When entire neighborhoods were labeled as criminal spaces, every person within them became suspect by default. Innocence was no longer assumed. It had to be proven, often in moments where fear and authority collided. Malcolm argued that this constant pressure was not accidental. It served to remind marginalized communities of their place within the social order and to discourage resistance by normalizing intimidation. What made his analysis especially unsettling was how clearly it anticipated the future. He spoke of a system where stops, searches, and force would be justified not by individual behavior, but by identity itself. Over time, these practices would be explained away through statistics, selective reporting, and official statements that reduced human suffering to numbers and procedures. The language of order would replace the language of justice, and accountability would remain out of reach. Malcolm also understood the psychological toll of this reality. Living under constant suspicion reshapes how people see themselves and how they move through the world. It teaches caution where there should be confidence, silence where there should be voice. He warned that children would grow up learning rules not written in law books, but passed down through experience. rules designed to minimize harm in encounters that should never have been dangerous to begin with. This, he believed, was one of the most damaging effects of systemic policing, because it trained future generations to expect inequality as normal. Importantly, Malcolm rejected the idea that patience or quiet endurance would solve this problem. He did not call for chaos or aggression. He called for clarity. He insisted that communities had the right to dignity and safety, and that defending oneself against unjust treatment was not the same as promoting harm. His stance challenged a society more comfortable condemning resistance than confronting the conditions that made resistance necessary. Connected to his broader vision, Malcolm saw police brutality as a symptom of deeper imbalances in power. Without political influence, economic stability, and control over their own institutions, communities would remain vulnerable to abuse. Reform without structural change, he argued, would only adjust the surface while leaving the foundation intact. Today, his words resonate not because they are dramatic, but because they are consistent. The patterns he described continue to appear, reshaped by time but rooted in the same logic. Malcolm did not offer easy solutions, but he offered something more enduring, a framework for understanding how authority operates, how narratives justify force, and why true safety cannot exist without justice. Malcolm S. understood that once a person challenges power, the next battle is over meaning. After warning about media control and exposing how authority operates on the streets, he confronted the label that followed him everywhere: violent, hateful, extremist. He rejected it not defensively, but logically. For Malcolm, the real distortion was the idea that enduring harm quietly was moral, while resisting it was dangerous. He argued that this inversion of values was one of the most effective tools used to maintain imbalance, because it taught people to fear their own survival instincts. In Malcolm's view, self-defense was not an ideology, nor a call to chaos. It was a basic human right that existed long before politics or headlines. He asked a simple question that unsettled many. If a person is threatened, attacked, or denied safety, why is protecting oneself treated as wrongdoing? The answer, he believed, had little to do with ethics and everything to do with control. A society that demands restraint only from the vulnerable is not seeking peace. It is preserving hierarchy. This argument connected directly to the media narratives he warned about earlier. By portraying him as dangerous, the focus shifted away from the conditions he was describing. Conversations about unjust treatment, unequal protection, and structural fear were replaced with debates about tone, image, and respectability. Malcolm saw this as deliberate. If his message could be reduced to anger, it would never have to be answered. If his character could be questioned, his analysis could be ignored. What made his position uncomfortable was its clarity. He did not glorify suffering, nor did he romanticize confrontation. He simply refused to accept that morality required submission. To him, dignity without safety was an illusion, and calls for calm that ignored ongoing harm were empty. He pointed out that those who condemned self-defense rarely lived under the conditions they were advising others to tolerate. Distance made restraint easy to preach. Malcolm also challenged the idea that advocating self-defense meant advocating harm. He drew a sharp distinction between initiating aggression and refusing to be victimized. This nuance was often lost, especially in a media environment that thrived on extremes. Complexity does not travel well in headlines. A measured argument can be reshaped into a threat with a few selective words. Malcolm knew this, and yet he continued to speak, fully aware of how his words would be framed. His rejection of the extremist label was not an attempt to soften his message. It was an attempt to reclaim it. He insisted that love for one's people did not require hatred of others, and that demanding justice did not equal promoting destruction. What he opposed was not coexistence, but imbalance. What he challenged was not humanity, but hypocrisy. In this way, his philosophy aligned with everything he had said before: awareness before obedience, truth before comfort. By refusing to accept distorted portrayals, Malcolm forced audiences to confront a deeper question. Why is resistance so often condemned, while the conditions that provoke it are normalized? Why is order valued more than fairness, and quiet more than safety? These questions remain unresolved, not because they are unclear, but because answering them requires confronting structures that prefer silence. Malcolm's stance on self-defense was ultimately about agency. It was about refusing to surrender one's humanity to narratives designed to erase it. In a world eager to simplify and categorize, he stood in the uncomfortable space between labels, insisting that survival, dignity, and self-respect were not radical demands. They were fundamental. As Malcolm X moved beyond exposing media control, symbolic leadership, and domestic injustice, his vision widened rather than narrowed. He began to speak not only about what was happening inside the United States, but about how those struggles fit into a much larger global pattern. To Malcolm, oppression was never confined by borders. It followed a recognizable logic wherever power concentrated itself, and once that pattern was understood, connections between distant communities became impossible to ignore. Malcolm argued that Black liberation in America could not be fully understood in isolation. He saw parallels between the experiences of Black communities in the United States and people living under colonial domination across Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. These were not superficial comparisons. He pointed to shared realities: displacement, economic dependency, restricted movement, and narratives crafted by powerful outsiders to justify control. What differed was geography, not structure. This perspective challenged the way many people were taught to think about injustice. Instead of viewing struggles as separate, Malcolm framed them as interconnected expressions of the same system. Colonialism abroad and racial hierarchy at home were not opposites. They were partners. Both relied on force backed by storytelling, on portraying domination as order and resistance as disorder. This understanding aligned directly with his earlier warnings about media manipulation. If stories could be controlled, then suffering could be normalized, and solidarity could be prevented. Malcolm's pilgrimage to Mecca marked a turning point in how he articulated this global vision. There, he encountered people of different races and cultures united by shared belief and mutual respect. This experience deepened his conviction that division was learned, not natural, and that unity was not an abstract ideal but a lived possibility. When he later spoke about Palestine, Africa, and newly independent nations, he did so not as an outsider borrowing causes, but as someone recognizing familiar patterns of struggle. He believed that when people understand their situation as part of a global context, their sense of power changes. Isolation breeds helplessness, but connection breeds strategy. Malcolm encouraged Black Americans to see themselves as part of a global majority resisting domination in different forms. This was not about replacing one identity with another, but about expanding awareness. The goal was not sympathy alone, but coordinated understanding. What made this message unsettling was its implication. If struggles were linked, then responsibility extended beyond borders. Neutrality became harder to justify. Malcolm understood that global solidarity threatened systems built on fragmentation. As long as communities were encouraged to see their pain as unique or unrelated, collective pressure remained weak. Unity, even intellectual unity, challenged that arrangement. He also recognized how narratives were used to sever these connections. International conflicts were framed selectively, stripped to historical context, and presented in ways that discouraged identification. Malcolm resisted this framing by insisting on historical continuity. He urged people to ask who benefits from division, and who loses when struggles are treated as unrelated events rather than expressions of the same imbalance of power. Importantly, Malcolm's emphasis on global solidarity was not about replacing local action with distant concern. It was about strengthening local struggles by grounding them in a broader understanding of justice. He believed that knowing others were facing similar conditions could clarify goals, sharpen analysis, and prevent movements from being co-opted or diluted. In this way, global solidarity became a natural extension of everything Malcolm had already argued. Awareness led to agency. Agency demanded connection, and connection made real change imaginable. His message was simple but demanding. Freedom is never a single story, and liberation is strongest when people recognize that their futures are bound together, even across oceans and borders. For Malcolm, political empowerment was never a matter of appearance or symbolism. After exposing how media shapes perception, how celebrity figures can distract from real leadership, how policing reflects deeper power imbalances, and how global struggles are interconnected, he arrived at a conclusion that tied everything together. Without control at the community level, freedom remains fragile. Laws could change, faces in government could change, even language could change. But if power itself stayed elsewhere, the conditions of everyday life would remain largely untouched. Malcolm believed that marginalized communities were often invited into politics only at its surface. Voting, representation, and public gestures were offered as proof of progress, while the deeper mechanisms of decision-making remained closed off. This kind of inclusion, he argued, created the illusion of participation without delivering real authority. People were encouraged to celebrate milestones while their schools, neighborhoods, and economic futures were still shaped by forces they could not influence. Symbolic reforms made inequality look more polite, but no less real. Education sat at the center of Malcolm's vision, because he understood that political power, without understanding, is easily manipulated. His own life stood as evidence of this belief. Largely self-taught, he transformed knowledge into clarity, and clarity into purpose. He warned that an education system detached from community needs would reproduce dependency rather than liberation. Learning, in his view, was not about credentials or status, but about developing the ability to analyze systems, recognize patterns, and act collectively. An informed community could no longer be guided by slogans alone. This emphasis on education connected directly to his critique of media narratives. If people are taught what to think instead of how to think, participation becomes passive. Malcolm insisted that communities must generate their own analysis, define their own priorities, and train their own leaders. Without this foundation, political involvement becomes reactive, responding to crises rather than shaping outcomes. True empowerment, he believed, begins long before a ballot is cast. Community control was the practical extension of this idea. Malcolm argued that decisions affecting daily life should not be made by distant institutions unfamiliar with local realities. Schools, safety, housing, and economic development were not abstract policy issues. They were lived experiences. When communities lack control over these areas, frustration accumulates and is often misdirected. Malcolm saw this loss of agency as intentional, because dependent communities are easier to manage than self-directed ones. He was skeptical of reforms that promised fairness without redistributing power. Passing laws, while important, did not guarantee enforcement or cultural change. Malcolm warned that legislation without accountability could even strengthen the illusion that justice had been achieved, making further demands appear unreasonable. This skepticism did not come from despair, but from experience. He had watched promises made and broken, progress announced and delayed, while conditions on the ground changed little. Participation, in Malcolm's framework, meant more than presence. It meant ownership. It meant shaping agendas rather than responding to them. He believed communities must build institutions that reflected their values, supported their people, and prepared future generations to lead. This work was slow, often invisible, and rarely celebrated, but it was the only path he saw toward lasting change. What made Malcolm's vision challenging was its demand for responsibility. Empowerment could not be granted. It had to be constructed. Education required effort, organization required discipline, and participation required risk. There were no shortcuts, no substitutes for sustained involvement. Yet Malcolm believed that once communities recognized their collective strength, symbolic victories would no longer satisfy them. In the end, his message was consistent with everything he had warned about before. Control of narrative, control of space, control of knowledge, and control of decision-making are inseparable. Without community control, politics becomes theater. With it, even small actions can reshape the future. Malcolm did not offer guarantees, but he offered a roadmap grounded in reality, insisting that dignity, power, and freedom begin where people take responsibility for themselves and each other. Malcolm X understood, perhaps more clearly than anyone around him, the cost of speaking without compromise. As his message sharpened and his independence grew, he openly acknowledged what many feared but refused to say, that telling uncomfortable truths would likely end his life. This was not spoken with despair, but with resolve. He believed that when ideas challenge powerful structures too directly, the individual carrying them becomes expendable. History, he knew, had followed this pattern many times before. What Malcolm also foresaw was something far more complex than his death itself. He predicted that in life, he would be vilified, reduced to a symbol of anger, and dismissed as dangerous. After death, he expected his words to be selectively remembered, softened, distorted, or stripped of their deeper meaning. This misrepresentation, he believed, would serve a purpose. If his message could be confined to a caricature, then the systems he criticized would never have to answer for themselves. Labeling him extreme was easier than engaging with what he exposed. Yet Malcolm believed that truth has a longer lifespan than reputation. He understood that while power can control narratives for a time, lived experience eventually forces people to look back and reassess. Conditions he described would persist. Patterns he warned about would repeat. And when future generations searched for language to explain what they were seeing, they would find his words waiting. In this sense, Malcolm believed his influence would grow only after he was gone, when people could no longer dismiss him as a threat in the present. That prediction has proven unsettlingly accurate. Decades later, his analysis continues to resonate not because it belongs to the past, but because it describes the present with precision. His insistence on self-respect, critical thinking, community control, and global awareness still challenges those who encounter it honestly. Malcolm did not offer comfort. He offered clarity. And clarity, even today, remains disruptive. What makes his legacy endure is not perfection, but evolution. Malcolm changed, learned, and refined his thinking publicly, refusing to remain trapped by earlier conclusions when new understanding emerged. This willingness to grow is often overlooked, yet it is central to his relevance. He was not interested in being remembered as a statue or slogan. He wanted people to think, to question, and to act with intention. In the end, Malcolm X did not measure success by approval. He measured it by impact. He believed that if his ideas continued to provoke thought, inspire organization, and awaken self-respect long after his voice was silenced, then his life had meaning beyond survival. His death did not end the conversation. It ensured it would continue. Thank you for staying with this story and engaging with these ideas. If you found value in this exploration and want to see more content that digs beneath the surface of history, power, and identity, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps keep these conversations alive and ensures that voices like Malcolm X are not only remembered, but truly understood.